I'm pleased to kick this off. This is a second meeting focusing on a book that Earl Carr helped edit for us, Trump to Biden and Beyond. And so it wasn't obvious from the title of the presentation. We'll be looking at U.S.-China relations within the context that's been laid out. I am Ben Reams. I'm the executive director of ADST, the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. But in my real life, I'm a Foreign Service officer with the State Department, where I'll be going back in 6 months from now. So I'm really pleased to be here and to be part of these policy discussions. And at this point, in the interest of time, I'm just going to introduce the moderator, Beatrice Camp. Bea, she is a retired Foreign Service officer, now editor of the American Diplomacy Journal, an online quarterly journal first published in 1996. She was the consul general in Shanghai and was the first woman and first public diplomacy officer to lead a U.S. consulate in China. Her other assignments include Beijing, Bangkok, Stockholm, Budapest, Chiang Mai, and Washington, D.C. Quite jealous of those. She twice managed U.S. participation in World Fairs, Shanghai Expo in 2010 and the Milan Expo of 2015. And she's also served as a senior advisor at the Smithsonian. So I'm going to hand it over to her, and I will let you all know that we expect a poll to pop up at some point during the presentation, and we'll be able to continue the conversation while folks answer that. I think it only takes a minute or so. So I'll hand it over to you, Beatrice. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, ADST. I'm a regular user of the ADST oral histories. Right now, I've been looking at a lot of the histories involved with diplomatic efforts after the dissolution of the Soviet Union for our next issue, our February 1 issue. So it's always very helpful, and I'm very pleased to be doing this. And thank you also to our panelists for joining us today to talk about this book, which is, I'm very impressed by how broad and deep the chapters are about the whole range of US-China relations. Some of the crucial issues that are facing us today in this book, from Trump to Biden and beyond. I also couldn't help but noticing that the foreword was written by Ken Jarrett, who was my predecessor in Shanghai at the Consulate General. So that was fun for me to see. So we're going to start with Dr. Carolyn Kissane, who is from the Center for Global Affairs at New York University. Her chapter in the book is Competitive Energy and Climate Statecraft. But I have to ask first, since I was at the NYU Shanghai Groundbreaking, how it's going, and does it have any role in climate strategy?
Well, thank you so much, and many thanks to ADST for hosting this event, and it really is a pleasure to be here. And Bea, thank you for moderating, and great to be here also with my co-authors. NYU Shanghai is going well. Of course, it's been a rather challenging 2 years, but we are doing well in Shanghai and here in New York City. And it's been really great to see the growth and the development of NYU Shanghai. And we also, of course, have NYU Abu Dhabi. I think climate is an issue that cuts across a lot of what NYU is doing, whether it be in Shanghai or in Abu Dhabi or here in New York City. I think we're seeing a lot more classes, definitely a lot more interest from students. I myself started very recently, just in the last year, an energy, climate justice and sustainability lab. There's a environmental justice incubator now at NYU. So to answer your question, I would say yes, climate is part of NYU Shanghai as well as part of the larger university and its efforts.
Right, good to hear. You write that the Belt and Road Initiative features energy as a key pillar. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure, and it's very interesting because where myself, because I used to work in Central Asia and spent a lot of time living and studying in Kazakhstan. Lots of attention right now on the goings on in Kazakhstan. And actually China launched the Belt Road Initiative from Kazakhstan. So, it kind of goes back to the early 2000s, sort of predating the launch of BRI, that, China was moving deep into Central Asia because of its natural resources, especially Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, which all have relatively significant oil and gas resources. So I think we've seen it through the development of pipelines. We are seeing it through the development of a lot of trade between the Central Asian states and China. BRI is important for Central Asia, as it is important as a kind of a foreign policy instrument for China.
Well, you talk about the contradictions of China building coal plants overseas, but also exporting solar panels and being one of the main sources of renewables, electric vehicles, et cetera. So how is that playing out? What does it look like in the future?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, no, it's a great question. In my chapter, I call it sort of China's the Jekyll and Hyde, because China sort of wears two hats when we look at the larger question of energy. It is a energy giant. It is the largest importer of oil. It is second only to Japan for its LNG imports. It recently surpassed South Korea. It will probably surpass Japan in probably the next year. So it is hungry for energy, all different types of energy. And of course, we also know that China is the largest carbon emitter. On a per capita basis, that is not the case. The United States is larger, but still not the largest. But China is also a major supplier and exporter of renewable energy technologies, whether we're talking about the technologies that go into wind, solar, electric vehicles. We're seeing a really rapid proliferation and adaptation in China of electric vehicles, as EVs that we'll see being exported. So I think from the renewable energy side, China is a very, very important player in the overall energy transition space as the world seeks to decarbonize. Technologies that are coming out of China and new research and development that China is committing to will be important for that. But at the same time, it is a very large consumer of fossil fuels. And I would just add, and I think it's kind of maybe a story that doesn't get a lot of attention, but the United States is also is benefiting from China's sort of hunger and thirst for gas as well as for oil. We in the United States, we export oil to China. In the last 6 months, the United States has become the second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas to China. In fact, there were 4 long-term LNG contracts that were signed in October and November between the United States, I should say, independent companies here that operate in the United States, between the United States and China. So what I described as a kind of a complex interdependence when we're thinking and talking about the relationship between the United States and China.
Thank you. Just one more quick question on the Jekyll and Hyde and the ramifications for the US, because the solar panels and the sourcing in Xinjiang, has that had an effect? I mean, are people, are consumers or governments aware of that in the US and looking at that? Is that making any kind of difference to what we're purchasing?
I think another fantastic question. I think from the consumer side, I would say there's probably less attention or less understanding. I think from the developer side, in terms of the companies that use and install panels here on the US side, are more cognizant and worry about the ramifications of their own supply chains and what that would mean when they lose that access. I think it's also driving the United States to say, okay, we need to be either sourcing outside of the Xinjiang area for solar panels, developing our own capacity But we're still seeing trade in those solar companies.
Well, thank you very much. I think we need to move on to one of the biggest issues in U.S.-China relations, Taiwan. And we have Dr. Guibo Huang from National Zhengzhou University in Taiwan. And we are very appreciative of his staying up past midnight to be on this panel. So I know it's late there, and thank you very much. You set out two scenarios for cross-strait relations, and can you outline them briefly and maybe give your own estimate of the chances of success of one or both of these scenarios?
Okay, thank you very much, Beatrice, and again, thanks for for organizing this event, and very nice to meet all the co-authors and old and new friends. I'm speaking from one of the flashpoints between US and mainland China, but I can assure you that, the night is peaceful and chill. Now, the temperature is only like 50 Fahrenheit, 50 degree. And, most of us don't have heater at home. So it's kind of cold indoors. But that said, but I think the scenarios in the Taiwan Straits are hot, and they have a lot of changes, I have to say. But my scenarios actually indicated a better direction towards these trilateral relationships among Taiwan, US, and mainland China. But it's important to know that actually domestic politics, I think, has prevailed in my prediction. That is not only in mainland China, but also in Taipei and in Washington. Domestic politics will probably influence the future course of these trilateral interactions. But in comparison with the era of President Trump, I think the future course will be more predictable. And maybe based on what I have been seeing since the beginning of last year, I think now the trilateral relationships among US, Taiwan, and mainland China is now more and more manageable. Okay, but I think now Taiwan is moving towards its very major local elections. So again, Taiwan's relations with mainland China will become a very hot issue when the elections is coming up.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping is going to have his third term, and I think he's going to have greater pressure of showing the responsibility of holding the Taiwan issue from derailing. It's very important for him because now it's, again, his third term. If he cannot manage the so-called Taiwan issue, and although he's a strong man, strong leadership, but I believe within the party, his possible failure to manage the so-called Taiwan issue will become one of the very big weaknesses for her future leadership. And after his leadership, he will be severely criticized by his party fellows. So, there's very little room for Xi Jinping to make any compromise. As for the US, I hope that the US will be able to help Taiwan and quote unquote tell Taiwan not to irritate the Beijing authorities in an unnecessary way. Also, I hope that the US can continue its arms sales to Taiwan to help Taiwan defend itself. Also, the US can give more support, more than moral support, for Taiwan's meaningful international participation, so that this strong will from this value coalition, value alliance, can be shown in a clear way And so the Beijing authorities will know that U.S. Is not only saying this but also doing this. And I think the stronger leadership and the stronger presence of the U.S. in this trilateral relationship will help manage and stabilize this relationship. And I think actually that will benefit most of the parties involved.
Well, thank you. You mentioned irritating China. Trump lifted the self-imposed restrictions on US government officials dealing with Taiwan, restrictions that I internalized as a Foreign Service officer. For example, during the Trump administration, he sent a you write about cabinet official who went to Taiwan. Is that continuing under the Biden administration, or have we returned to the restrictions of the past?
It's interesting to see Secretary of State Pompeo announce the cancellation of all regulations or restrictions against Taiwan 9 days before he stepped down. And actually, the Biden administrations put some of them back. Okay, but I think for the U.S. maneuvering between Beijing and Taipei, we in Taipei know that the U.S. sometimes has to make some concessions with the Beijing authorities so that this trilateral relationship can move on in a peaceful and stable way. And to me, I was on public service leave to work in Republic of China Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 2 years. I serve as chairman of the Research and Planning Committee, sort of equivalent to your Director of Policy Planning staff. So I can tell you that even though there were a lot of restrictions on Taiwan's official visit to the U.S., but I think we as officials from MOFA can always go to the U.S. and meet the right person at the right places. And so I think these substantive exchanges between Taiwan and U.S. Were not affected by these U.S. Unilateral restrictions on Taiwan. So it's unfortunate there are some restrictions, but I think as long as the U.S. can do whatever it has done before, I think things should be fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Earl, you had a poll that you were going to launch to ask our participants about their opinions on U.S.-China relations. And we'll continue talking during that, but do you want to go ahead and put that up now?
Sure, thank you.
So we'll give everybody a couple minutes to look at those. But meanwhile, I think we'll continue with Asad Husseini, who is in Dubai and wrote the chapter on Rethinking Strategic Alignment with Gulf States. Asad Husseini is engaged in real estate and investment in Dubai, and also staying up late, although not as late as Dr. Huang, to be part of this program. So Asad, you write about the UAE and Saudi Arabia increasing their economic relationship with China, coupled with the US drawing down in the region. So what does that portend?
Well, I mean, first of all, truly thank you for your time. And I can't take any of Quavo's glory. He's really up way past his bedtime. So thank you again for that. But I think very important to maybe set the backdrop as to how we got to where we are initially. I mean, Saudi Arabian and American ties go back to, I would say, probably the end of World War II. I think everyone's sort of seen the picture with the King of Saudi Arabia with the US president on a naval carrier. These are very long historic ties, but I think they've developed through the spectrum of military and political cooperation historically. And there really hasn't been, and for structural reasons, I imagine that the United States can't really engage in an economic fashion the same way as China does, because the economy and the government are just not as closely sort of stitched together as they are in other parts of the world. But I mean, today as we stand, I think very fundamentally the security guarantor by and large is the United States, and the Gulf security strategy very much is sort of underpinned by a prolonged presence by the US. I frankly think, and statistically it's there, the amount of US troops have drawn down. They may have peaked somewhere around 2010 or 11 with the Iraqi surge, and they've been on a consistent downward trend. So that sort of, I think, forced the Gulf to look elsewhere, both from an economic and from a security standpoint. I think the Abraham Accords probably a very good example of that, where there's more integration between regional players in a way that historically may not have been the case. Economics drives that, but I think underlying security concerns also drive that. And I mean, just to sort of, if I can dig into that point, China's taken a much more economically driven approach when dealing with the Gulf. And I think that's also underpinned by the fact that I may have a slightly controversial opinion about this, but I feel China is fundamentally weak in this part of the world. What I mean by that is they get about approximately, I would say, about a third of their oil supply from this part of the world, but have probably zero force projection capability. And the reality is the presence of US forces in this part of the world, I think, probably underwrites Chinese political and economic risk more than it helps the US government itself. So in an absence, when you don't have any hard power, I think soft power is all you got. And they've used that extremely well. So I mean, in terms of economic integration, they've invested very aggressively through the 1-2-3 agreement, which is basically cooperation, infrastructure, and investment. The investment has really been qualitatively driven, I imagine, more so than other parts of the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, we've seen oil and gas concessions come in place. We've seen very strategic port investments that sort of seek to, particularly in Oman, in an area called Duqm, that seek to bypass the underlying risk of the Strait of Hormuz ever getting mined, and just choking off global oil supplies. Duqm is a very strategically placed port that just bypasses a lot of that risk. DUQM for anybody that's interested. And I think the other element has been tech investments. I mean, a lot of telephonic infrastructure, a lot of 5G infrastructure comes in through China. There's a lot of knowledge sharing. A company that I quite like is Sensitime. They've come in, set up a headquarters here, and are really actively engaged in technology transfer and are AI focused in a way that does not exist. The last leg of their strategy for me probably is financial integration. And you've got a one clearinghouse here in China that enables you to effectively go ahead and swap UAE dirhams for Chinese yuan without ever needing to go through dollars, going through the dollar system rather. Is it going to replace the dollar? Absolutely not. I mean, that's just not going to happen. But the reality is they're very actively taking steps to sort of cut the US out or not be so US centric. In that format, there's a strong presence of Asian banks here. And I think there's just been a ridiculous amount of Chinese investment, both in commerce and in real estate in this part of the world. And frankly, I think we're sitting here and looking at us and be like, where is the US in this mix? I mean, yes, you underpin us from a security perspective. Yes, there's a good amount of political reliance in the US, but from an economic perspective, it just hasn't shown up. And then it's been, at times, it's been economically difficult to work with the US. A good example for me is the F-35 partnership. The talks just got suspended. And a lot of that has to do with US concerns around the 5G infrastructure that Huawei is setting up in this part of the world. I mean, great, but give us an alternative. And if you can't, then get out of our way. That's just the disconnect that I see, quite frankly, is just around the politicians are saying something, but then the private sector does not walk in tow, and you just don't have a viable alternative. And that's where the real gap between US, China, and Gulf relations exists, in my opinion.
Thank you. Continuing on the Gulf, when you talk about the commercial dominance or role of China and investment, I'll have to go back to Xinjiang question here. Is there no concern or no response from the Gulf countries about the treatment of Muslim citizens in Xinjiang? Does that play any role?
Honestly, and usually quiet on that front. I think fundamentally in this part of the world, politics is politics and economics is economics, and we very conveniently choose to look the other way. I think convenience of being a democracy where the leadership can get away with doing that in a way that you can in other parts of the world. But honestly, the only things I've ever heard have been out of the US, maybe out of Europe. I have seen maybe one statement by the Saudi government condemning treatment, but that's about it. Nothing really else in this part of the world, at least.
Thank you. Well, and now I also have to ask about the Dubai Expo. So
I haven't been, by the way. Just
haven't been, but what about China's involvement there? I mean, considering how much China put into the Shanghai Expo, and I can imagine that they have one of the largest pavilions. I I don't know. I haven't
I mean,
read anything about it.
It's
But
a good example because it's, I mean, just very fundamentally to touch upon what you just said. I mean, it's a very good example of what I was saying earlier. The Chinese government over there, it's been a national effort. I think there was some sort of committee in place. They really went out and they said, we want to capture parts of Chinese culture. We want the food, we want the economic ties, we want the cultural ties, we want to encapsulate our technological advancements, trade, et cetera. When you walk over to the US pavilion, you see Apple, you see SpaceX. I'm pretty sure there's a McDonald's in there somewhere. And there just seems to be a lack of underlying strategy. Our private sector is fantastic. And I mean, I think it's second to none anywhere else, to any other country on earth. But the reality is that overlying centralized planning element is just missing. And then it shows very, very clearly when you look into situations like this. And that's the reality, honestly, epitomized in the Expo as well.
Maybe I'm getting into areas that you haven't, that you don't know about, but are there many Chinese visitors to the Expo?
Oh, yes. I mean, yes. I mean, today, I don't know specifically to the Expo, but the largest cohorts of visitors historically were Russian and European. Today it's Chinese. So the largest by population, the largest number of visitors from any single country from China, shortly followed by Russia. Then Europe is a distant third.
Yeah, no, I'm just interested in the connections between Dubai and Shanghai, you know, competing for the tallest.
And it is robust. I got to tell you, it truly is robust. If I can give one statistic, sorry to maybe cut you off, but I mean, 2000 trade between China and the Gulf in general, I think was something around to the tune of about $10 billion. 2016, it was $150 billion. And I believe it's in excess of $200 billion today. So, I mean, we have not seen anywhere near that growth. And that's not by accident. There's been a very sort of concerted strategy on both ends to really facilitate that kind of growth. And it exists, and China is a real player. Whereas growing up, I would have never heard about China. It was just always the US. That's not the case, sadly, anymore.
Yeah, the connections are quite notable. And, you know, the flights as well, the flights through Dubai and from the Middle East to China.
If I can say one last thing, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is the UAE deliberately walking up and like, you know what, US, we're done with you, want to walk away. The leadership here, the UAE ambassador in Washington, DC, I mean, we've always said that our number one go-to country has always been the US. But when you've had a history of the US consistently failing to deliver at an economic and political level, it forced us to hedge ourselves and look for alternatives in a way that honestly, instinctively, we would not like to. But it's just a series of cascading failures has probably led us down this path, more out of circumstance than our choosing, truly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Earl has informed me that the poll results are ready. Do you want to tell us what you found from our participants? Let's see. Concerned about the future direction. Well, yes. Optimistic about the future. 26%, 32% no. Yep, I think some of those concerns are being reflected in this discussion. Thank you, Earl. Let me introduce our final panelist, Dr. Jackson Ewing, who wrote the chapter on Pathways for U.S.-China Climate Cooperation. He is with Duke University and also involved with Duke Kunshan. So that's another of the US campuses in Shanghai where I enjoyed being at the groundbreaking of that program. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit a little further down. But first, I wanted to start with your optimism about revitalizing and deepening climate cooperation between US and China. But is there really space for renewed engagement, considering how much vitriol there is on the relationship these days?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me, to all of my ADST colleagues. And it's been fascinating to hear my fellow co-authors already during our session today. It depends on how we frame and consider that engagement itself. On the one hand, I think that we see evidence that much of what I called for in the chapter has started to come to fruition, specifically a return to dialogue between the major performers of climate change policy in the US and China after a fallow period during the Trump administration has absolutely taken hold. We learned at COP26, I think perhaps unsurprisingly, that Xi Jinping and his delegation in China and Secretary Kerry in the United States had met roughly 36 times, or at least members of their teams had met roughly 36 times in the year leading up to COP26. The idea that these countries can highlight aligned bilateral ambition, I think, was reflected in their joint statement at COP26. Excuse me for all of our participants. That's the Conference of Parties held by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, held annually. This past year it was in Glasgow, Scotland, which was both a great surprise to those of us at COP26, and I think many observers of US-China relations and of climate change diplomacy internationally, that it came to fruition at all. It was not predicted or known to be in the offing, even by many who watched the issue set closely. But that being said, it was critiqued, I think largely justifiably, for being fairly broad. So it begs the question of whether that kind of broad declaration of alignment on reaching the core goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change to keep our temperature increases largely in check is a paper tiger and simply an easy political play to signal a cooperative kind of initiative towards that end, or whether it actually is signaling a level of commitment that will be impactful in the longer term. I think within that agreement, we also, or declaration, I should say, we did see a bit of tangibility. The US committed to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. China committed to phasing down its coal consumption during the 15th five-year plan, which is the latter half of this decade. But again, there's a counter to that position. That declaration of 100% carbon-free electricity is not very durable. That will be dependent on decisions of future executives and future Congresses here in the United States. Similarly, in China, that coal phase down was a pretty easy political diplomatic move for them to make. They had every intention of doing that anyway. So I do see engagement happening. There are very, very serious and open questions about how effective and impactful it will ultimately be.
What happened to EPA engagement with China? I remember during the Shanghai Expo in 2010, EPA was cooperating with Shanghai EPA on Air Now International. There were a lot of things going on. Has that continued?
So it's a great thing to bring up. I think we often miss or underestimate, I should say, the degree to which the EPA specifically helped with the initial creation of environmental policymaking domestically in China. The MEP, the Ministry for Environmental Protection, which has become absorbed into the current Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which also encompasses other environmental policymaking bodies, was formed with the EPA as a model, and the level of cross pollination between the EPA and both that national level environmental policymaking apparatus, and, as you refer to in the Shanghai example, some provincial level implementation bodies, has been really robust for decades. I think that at present that connectivity still exists, but is no longer taking the form that it once did. And in part, that is not a result of the decline in the US-China relations, but the more mature station that the MEE has now arrived at in terms of domestic environmental management. There's still enormous room to grow. And here I'm not talking about climate so much as reining in air pollution, soil pollution, water pollution, and the like. But China has made significant strides and is continually evolving its ministerial and implementation capabilities on those fronts. On the climate front internationally, not necessarily from EPA, but in a broader sense of experimentation on the sorts of policy mechanisms that could help to mitigate and adapt to climate change, I do see substantial interaction between practitioners in China and the US, but much of that happens at the track 2 level. So things like creating China's national emissions trading system, formulating international approaches to sharing and trading mitigation outcomes in the form of carbon credits and otherwise, technology intersections on clean energy and connectivity and value chains across some energy infrastructure, including that which Prof. Ghassan discussed earlier. There is work there, but it's not at that sort of top level track 1 government to government.
Well, thank you. I was going to ask about track 2 engagement, so thank you for bringing that up. We haven't said anything about the Olympics yet, and there's a lot of political and other issues, but on the climate front, China's taking a big leap into some, the skiing, the snow commitments that have, I would think, climate implications or environmental implications. Any comments on that?
I'm afraid I'm pretty ill-informed on that topic. I will say there is, as is often the case, I think a concern and an acknowledgement of the reality that the Olympics loom very large for much of the Chinese political and policymaking apparatus right now. As well as some other things on the calendar for the spring. So there is a concern for those of us who are hoping to see and in fact trying to contribute to rapid acceleration of power sector reform, of reforming China's coal tariffs, of building and improving upon that emissions trading system that I mentioned previously, at trying to curtail Chinese investment abroad into high emitting sectors in favor of having them scale up their investment into cleaner technologies and cleaner transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and the like, that much of that's going to be taking a back seat for the months to come because of indirect connectivity to the Olympics. So we're all kind of not, I wouldn't say in a holding pattern, but it is affecting the workflow.
Well, thank you. I think we've reached a time when we want to take Q&A, and I see one has already appeared in the chats. I thank you to all our panelists. Carolyn has had to leave. She had some responsibilities at NYU that she needs to take care of today, but I very much appreciate her joining us, as well as the rest of you. And Earl, do you want to take on the Q&A?
I'd be delighted to.
Thank you.
So for the first question from Mark Tauber, he asks, would anyone like to comment on the status/failure of the Trump Phase 1 economic agreement, trade, IP, NTBs against US exports, especially food sector? Would anyone like, any of our panelists like to take that?
Earl, you should clearly take that question on.
Thanks. Well, I think first and foremost, Mark, thank you for the question. And it's a great question. I think the fundamental failure of the Trump administration was really with the premise that implementing a trade war would in fact significantly reduce the trade deficit. He argued very passionately that that would be the case. At the end of 4 years of the Trump administration, the US-China trade deficit actually increased rather than decreased. So that was a clear indication that the trade war was an abject failure on that part. To the extent when you look at the trade figures current trade between the US and China, particularly if you look at exports, US exports to China from January to November of last year are up 30%. If you look at imports, US imports to China from January to November of last year are up 17%. So I think that what those numbers tell you and indicate is that in fact trade is quite robust. What we're seeing on the financial services sector is quite a fundamentally different story. You're seeing trade and financial services, particularly when you look at Chinese companies being delisted like Didi, Chinese telecom companies, et cetera, they're almost being squeezed at both sides. They're getting pressure from the Chinese government to delist. At the same time, they're getting pressured from the U.S. government, being blacklisted. 31 companies were issued by the Treasury Department. So I think on the trade angle, we're seeing a significant, robust movement and momentum now, but the financial services piece is a much more precarious position. Thank you. Any other questions?
I see there's one for Assad.
Okay, Assad, and feel free for all of you that would like to ask questions, feel free to use that in the ask questions in the Q&A. So we have a question from Nathaniel Scotchett, and one of the questions is, with Cambodia taking over as ASEAN chair, how will ASEAN deal with major issues in the region involving China, such as the Mekong River and the South China Sea? For Assad, I was so taken by your illustration of the robust ties between Shanghai and Dubai. We're increasingly talking about subnational diplomacy and city-to-city ties at state. Where, if anywhere, do you see opportunities between the US and your region?
I mean, opportunities, frankly, I see plenty, but I think it takes two willing participants to really actualize something. I mean, a good example for me, probably not the most obvious one to everybody else, would be perhaps Cleveland and Abu Dhabi. We have the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi, which is truly a world-class medical institution. I had dinner with the Swedish Minister of Health, and he said, you know what, we don't have healthcare like this in Sweden. You're very, very lucky, because it truly is something incredible. I think another example this is an example where it's worked out fantastically well from a medical standpoint, but I mean, a couple examples where it's failed and truly failed, hasn't done well, I think would be Abu Dhabi and parts of California. I mean, with Silicon Valley, there was a very concerted push a couple of years ago between and Abu Dhabi to actually go ahead. I mean, just by order of magnitude, for people that are not familiar, our sovereign wealth funds in any given year invest between, I would say, about $10 to $40 billion directly into Silicon Valley companies. And there was a real thesis in this part of the world thinking that, hey, we're putting so much money here, there must be a way to get some of these businesses to come over here and set up shop and really sort of interact with the local economy in a way that hasn't happened before. It was honestly a one-sided effort, didn't really materialize. There are definitely execution setbacks on our part as well. But then I think a little bit of, if there was, and I don't know if there is a mechanism like that in the US, but in China, you would see this. For example, a regional government comes in and suggests that startups in this province or that province go to this part of the world, set up shop. They really facilitated and pushed them to do so and really create economic value. There just wasn't the reception in the US or in California in this case, and specifically, to actually go ahead and have some sort of initiative where, by reciprocity in return for the investment, there will be a mechanism to really push a lot of these American companies through to Abu Dhabi. That did not work out well. I think in financial services, I could probably say the same thing. I mean, we have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in New York and other parts of the U.S., where with PE, hedge funds, et cetera, we really haven't seen the trickle back that I think we would hope for in terms of these firms coming in and locating in this part of the world, maybe attempt to do investments, or at least, screw it, guys, set up an investor relations office or something. I don't think it's that hard. And we just unfortunately haven't seen the reciprocity, at least en masse, in the way that we have with China. And I believe, honestly, in both of those sectors, in technology and financial services, those opportunities exist, and they're probably a lower hanging fruit vis-a-vis anything else.
Great. Thank you so much, Assad. That was great. Dr. Jackson Ewing, would you like to take the Southeast Asia question?
Yeah, thanks. I will. I know this is a bit outside the purview of my earlier comments, but I was actually living in Southeast Asia in 2012 when Cambodia held the chairpersonship of ASEAN, and that led to the infamous first ever ASEAN meeting without a resulting declaration, which was in turn a result of Cambodia refusing to sign off on language surrounding China's action in the South China Sea. Since that period, you could argue that Cambodia and China have grown closer together, where other counterparts to China in being able to be impactful on Cambodian behavior have declined, including that of the United States. If you look at some of the infrastructure in Cambodia and places like Sihanoukville along the coastline, it's largely on the back of Chinese dollars. So economic relationships are very robust there. I would suggest that ASEAN is unlikely to take a meaningful stance on the South China Sea in particular. Because of those factors. Now, one could argue about whether it would have anyway. So I'm not sure what the counterfactual there is. On the Mekong, the Mekong River Commission has typically struggled to engage China effectively, and it's created its own architecture for trying to deal with that watershed, which of course originates in China on the Tibetan Plateau, but is the lifeblood of central mainland Southeast Asia. So similarly, I would expect that a continuation of China's own parallel infrastructure or diplomatic infrastructure alongside China's preference for negotiations on bilateral levels rather than at ASEAN or MRC, Mekong River Commission levels is going to continue. I would be surprised otherwise.
Great. Thank you so much. And I would just add on to that I think if you look at the current administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that will be a key cornerstone of how the U.S. engages with ASEAN as well as other economies in Southeast Asia, particularly from a trade perspective, trying to sign some type of trade, free trade agreement at some point. Dr. Kuei-Bo Huang, I see your hand raised, and I did have a question for you, but please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll be quick. I just should also add on that. First, I think mainland China is using the Lancang-Mekong River Cooperation Mechanism to provide further funding to Myanmar's junta. I believe tens of millions US dollars just last month or 2 months ago. So it's hard to criticize that the mainland Chinese government to provide funding to the Myanmar junta that is sanctioned by the US government, because that funding was provided through the channel of Lancang-Mekong River Cooperation Mechanism for the regional stability, anti-terrorism, and food, agriculture, etc. So that's a leeway, I think, for this further cooperation between mainland China and Myanmar. And also on the South China Sea, I think with Cambodia being the chair country of ASEAN, I think mainland China is going to use this code of conduct negotiation with ASEAN members, try to woo more support from ASEAN members so that there will be a more peaceful atmosphere between mainland China and those concerned ASEAN members for the possibility of a code of conduct this year. At least Wang Yi has said that he hopes to finish that negotiation this year, and we'll see.
Kuei-Bo, while we have you, there has been so much controversy, discussion, media press on Lithuania and this kind of interesting China back and forth, with the Lithuanian president even coming out, even apologizing at one point. And then you had Taiwan apparently the next day saying they were going to offer some kind of $7 billion credit to Lithuania. Can you give us a bit of color and context on what is going on in this current situation?
Let me put it this way. The reason why Taiwan and Lithuania established an unofficial relationship last year, because first, all of our missions overseas were forced to change their titles from either Republic of China or Taiwan to Taipei. Yeah. So I think the current ruling party in Taiwan has had an urgent need to show to our people that it has the capability to break this dilemma, imposed by the mainland Chinese authorities. And in the past, actually in the 1990s, Taiwan and Lithuania had a very good opportunity to establish such a relationship. But because of something I forgot, and then the plan just stopped. But basically, Lithuanian government and its parliament show quite a few sympathy to Taiwan. And also, we heard a lot from our news media that the US played a role in that, in facilitating, the establishment of bilateral relations between Taiwan and Lithuania. So, that's probably why things happened. And now, the coalition government, the foreign minister has insisted on the decision of, allowing Taiwan to set up a Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius, while the president of Lithuania has said, setting up such an office is fine, but using the title Taiwanese is no good. We made a mistake. And he said there was no coordination between him and the cabinet members. We have no idea. And just 2 days ago, I think, the deputy foreign minister of Lithuania said, wow, we couldn't imagine that this, backfire from mainland China was so strong. But so we joke in Taiwan that, these Lithuanian officials should have consulted with us. We know how strong these mainland Chinese, fighting back would be. But anyway, so I think it's messy because Taiwan has poured, I would say, $1.2 billion in maintaining such a non-official relations with Lithuania, way more than a lot of investments we made to our diplomatic allies or to our important investment targets. That's a nation like Indonesia, India, and Vietnam. So I think this, to be quick, the Taiwan government is trying very hard to maintain the office, Taiwanese representative office in Lithuania, as a symbol that Taiwan can stand up against mainland China in this inferior position in diplomacy.
It's a fascinating kind of mouse that roared story. The Washington Post did a very colorful piece on it about people in Taiwan buying Lithuanian chocolates and rum and stuff. But it does highlight Taiwan's desire to be on the international stage.
Yeah, but we're afraid that what if there will be a next case? Then how much we're going to spend, and what would Taiwan's diplomatic allies would say to us? Maybe they want more. They want more after seeing this Lithuanian case.
Great point. Real quick, I know we're running out of time, but Jackson, I have a burning question that I want to ask you. Beijing recently came out with these new air standards that apparently they equate meeting international standards. Are you buying this?
Yeah, look, too soon to tell. I think there's always been enormous reticence on being transparent about the actual domestic air pollution problem, particularly at key municipal levels, to the extent that citizens were going towards other sources of information about air pollution, including those put out by the US Embassy. So while I sometimes think we overestimate to the point of cynicism our suspicion of Chinese environmental data, on the case of air, particulate air pollution, there's reason to sort of wait and see as to how strong the actual implementation will be, and how transparent and factual the attendant data will be. I do think the policy set, though, is sound, those implementation issues aside. And I also think that dovetails with broader trends in the Chinese economy that make it more likely that in this round it could be realizable. By that, I mean, ultimately, we will see a continuation of service sectors outstripping conventional manufacturing. We will ultimately see a decline in dependence on heavy industry and highly pollutive sectors, because that aligns with Chinese economic interests and its ongoing structural economic transformation in many parts of the country, including those where air pollution is of greatest concern to the population. And so as you see less, conventional steel, cement production, et cetera, less coal-fired power generation, that you will see an alignment between those largely economically driven goals and the domestic air pollution goals themselves. So I don't think that they're swimming in different directions to the extent that they have been at different parts of China's economic development.
Great. All right, so we have two last questions from the audience. If we can take them very quickly, Professor Huang, I'll let you take this question from Harvey Summers, and I'll respond to the trade question after that. So the question is from Harvey Summers: how is Taiwan viewing the current political developments in Hong Kong? How might that affect Taiwan-U.S. relations?
Okay, so during the Trump administration and before Taiwan's presidential election in 2020, Taiwan took the Hong Kong issue so seriously, and Taiwan government stood by Hong Kong, every moment. But now I think there is less and less so-called feeling about Hong Kong. But, basically most of us still feel that we have a responsibility of, helping Hong Kong maintain its autonomy. And we also think that the Chinese Communist commitment to Hong Kong for 50 years, no change in its political system, has failed. So, and that Hong Kong case has been a very bad example for future development of cross-strait relations. As for its impact on U.S.-Taiwan relations, I personally don't see any obvious impact on U.S.-Taiwan relations, but I think this Hong Kong issue has helped Taiwan and U.S. cooperate further, to manage this infringement on human rights and democracy in Hong Kong.
Thank you, Quibble. And I'll take the last question from Patrick Mully, who asks, Earl, do you think the 7 million total trade deficit the U.S. has run with China over the last 20 years, has that weakened the United States? I would say categorically, Patrick, that the trade has been mutually beneficial. When you look at companies like Apple that produce in China and then sell to the United States and various other countries, the fact that American consumers can buy products at significantly cheaper prices is good for the U.S. economy. The fact that Chinese consumers can consume various products from the United States. So I think that the deficit, when you look at the numbers on first glance, you would probably argue that, clearly China has been winning out in many, and there is a fundamental imbalance. And yes, there is that notion in terms of a revenue, but you have to really put things in a fundamental perspective and get the bigger overall picture, I would argue. With that, I will hand it over to our esteemed moderator, and I think some members from ADST would like to close.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be involved in this project with so many unanswered questions about China. I think we made some headway today, leaving a lot of questions for future discussion, future panels. I would have liked to get into Fulbright and Peace Corps and Houston Consulate and what's happening with that, but leave that for a future discussion. So again, I thank you very much. It was terrific to have so much expertise available this evening, and thank you to ADST for arranging this.
I just wanted to thank everybody. This has been a fascinating discussion, and as Beatrice said, obviously with this kind of thing, we're only scratching the surface each time. And on that note, I understand that Earl and team plan to do a third and final series in February. So I encourage everyone to stay tuned. I think the plan for that is to talk about grand strategies and the effect on regions and regionalism. So I'm happy to close there. Again, just offering ADST's thanks to the wonderful team, the great participation, and all the participants and attendees. And maybe a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, everyone.